Okay, welcome everyone to one of a few video lectures that is going to accompany the Brain and the Special Senses lab. Please take notes on this video lecture so that you come prepared into lab and you're ready to look at models and look at preserved specimens and do dissections. So in this first diagram, I want to talk about the lobes of the brain and I want to define a few terms. First of all, what we're looking at is the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is the most superior portion of the brain. I also want you to know that we are looking at a superior view of the cerebrum. And the labels you see on the diagram are all labeled on what is the left side of the brain. The cerebrum is divided by the longitudinal fissure into the left and the right cerebral hemispheres. And as you look at the cerebrum, you'll begin to notice what seems to be hills and valleys. The hills are known as gyri, and the valleys are known as sulci. The central sulcus is one of the more prominent sulci that runs down the middle of the lateral surface of the brain. And the central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Remember though, because the brain is divided into the left and the right hemispheres, each lobe will also have a left and a right as well. So up here is the left frontal lobe, here is the right frontal lobe. The central sulcus divides the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, the left and the right. On the back of the brain, you see the occipital lobe. And not pictured on this superior view, but you'll see it on the next slide, on the sides of the brain, we have another lobe called the temporal lobe. In fact, let's look at that right now. Here we can see a lateral view of the brain, and that shows you all the lobes we previously discussed, as well as the laterally located temporal lobe. Again, this is the left temporal lobe. The next item on this slide that you should look at is the cerebellum, the second part of the brain. Here was the cerebrum we just talked about. Here is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is located posteriorly and inferiorly to the cerebrum. Now let's cut the brain in half and take a mid-sagittal view. So let's imagine that we've sliced this brain in half and we're looking at one of the halves. You can see at the top we still see the cerebrum. And we now see the cerebellum quite well, and we also see the third part of the brain, the brainstem. The brainstem is made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, or the medulla oblongata. Going off of the medulla oblongata and through the foramen magnum is the spinal cord. Now, take a look at this C-shaped bit of tissue right in the middle of this image. This is called the corpus callosum, and the corpus callosum connects the left and the right cerebral hemispheres. Inferior to the corpus callosum is a space called the lateral ventricle. And the lateral ventricle is normally filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay? Next, continuing inferior, we find the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. The pineal gland is also sometimes called the epithalamus. Now, if we go back to the hypothalamus, and hanging off of the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is not part of the brainstem. It's just attached to it. Let's go to the next slide. Now we're looking at an inferior view of the brain, and an inferior view of the whole brain at that. So just to orient ourselves, we know that we are in an inferior view because we can only see bits of the frontal lobe and only see the underside of the cerebrum in general. We see the brainstem completely. Here's the pons, here's the medulla oblongata. Midbrain is up here. And we know also that we are looking at the rostral part at the top of the brain, at the top of the screen. A couple of things to notice in the inferior view. What we see here on the inferior surfaces of the frontal lobe, we actually see the olfactory nerves, the left and the right. This is the left, this is the right. Each of the olfactory nerves end in olfactory bulbs. Just inferior to that, we see this little cross section. This cross section is called the optic chiasm or the optic chiasma. And this is where parts of each optic nerve cross each other. This is all you need to know for the brain.